Welcome to Talkback Radio Network, the home of the Iron Microphone, with your hosts, Dr. Lawrence Gelman and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg.
Good morning. Welcome to the program. Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg and Dr. Lawrence Gelman with you on this beautiful Thursday morning on the East Coast, coming to you from South Texas. Good morning, Dr. Gelman.
Hi.
Hi.
Are we on the air?
We are on the air. I'm glad you could make it. You look very, very nattily dressed this morning.
Well, we were entertaining a congressman from Montana.
Oh, okay. Well, that's hence the suit.
Yeah.
And this morning, later on, in our second segment, we'll be speaking with a very, very distinguished guest, Malu Innocent, who's a foreign policy analyst with the Cato Institute, and we'll be talking about things in the Middle East, especially what's going on in Syria, and the uptick, and a question about whether we should be getting ourselves involved in that kind of mess. This morning, I wanted to talk to you just briefly about something. I don't know if you've seen this or not, and it crossed the wires last night, Dr. Gelman. And this was a fascinating law that's being passed in Arizona. I don't know if you have seen that or not, but it's the Arizona birth control bill.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
No, I don't live in Arizona.
You live in Arizona. Well, just really briefly, Arizona legislators have advanced an unprecedented bill that require women who wish to have their contraception covered by health care plans prove to their employers that they are taking to treat medical conditions. The bill also makes it easier for Arizona employers, if they wish to fire a employee for using birth control to prevent pregnancy despite the employer's moral objection. Under current law, health plans in Arizona that cover other prescription medications must also cover contraception. And there, of course, our friends at the ACLU, guess what they're saying?
I don't care.
You don't care. Okay. They obviously aren't supporting this bill, and I was just curious what you thought of it.
I don't think anything of it. It's none of the government's business. So that's it.
The government should just stay out of it.
It's none of the government's business.
Okay. Well, it is being, and the Republican author of the bill, Majority Whip Debbie Lasko, says that we don't live in the Soviet Union, so government should not be telling the organizations or mom and pop employers to do something against their moral beliefs.
Well, that's exactly right, except she's wrong on one issue. We do live in the Soviet Union. We live with a fascist government that tries to dictate to the American people how they should run their lives. And it's the divine right of kings all over again. I guess George Washington would have been surprised that King George III has been reincarnated in the form of Barack Obama, and that the aristocratic government of England is now the model that the United States uses. And here we don't deal with these type of what happened today topics, because what's popular today, no one will know about a year from now, except for general philosophical trends. Like, who knows who won the World Series 4 or 5 years ago? Probably very few people. And that's because we're so enmeshed in the daily events that the media wishes us to become cognizant of, that we lose perspective of the great truths. But we are here in order to enunciate those great truths, which are purposefully concealed from the American people, because it benefits the government to do so. It allows the government to keep us enslaved. And the reason that the mass media and the system of public education exist is to be propaganda arms of a fascist government. And it's fascist with Barack Obama, as it was fascist under George Bush, as it was fascist under Bill Clinton, as it was fascist under the first George Bush, etc., etc. So On this program, we are here to educate and teach the choir how to sing more than preaching to the choir, because even those who purport to be on our side, which is the libertarian side, really oftentimes don't seem to understand or the argument itself, and just take a position based upon superficial on superficial items. I thought we'd talk about the economy in general, and I've written a book on economics. It's 2 sentences. I tried to make it longer, but I couldn't think of anything more.
Who's publishing it?
My computer. And so my printer, what's my printer? My brother printer.
Your brother printer.
Right. And here it is. Here's my theory of economics. Capitalism is the voluntary movement of capital from the consumer to the producer. Communism is the involuntary movement of capital from the producer to the consumer. That's it. That's all you need to know in economics, and so therefore now you understand everything about economics. So if you want to look at some detail, let's look at what should we look at in detail. Let's look at something that I know is uppermost in everybody's mind, and that's fractional reserve banking.
Can you go back? I want to go back and say that your book again.
My book?
Yeah,
the book and the title are the same.
I know. In case we're trying to write it down here.
Capitalism is the voluntary movement of capital from the consumer to the producer. Communism is the involuntary movement of capital from the producer to the consumer.
I like that.
See, that's all you need to know. But now I know that we're always discussing at tea parties and in the bar fractional reserve banking. What is fractional reserve banking? Well, fractional reserve banking is the reason that the dollar is worthless today. Everybody thinks that the inflation is a natural process, and it is not a natural process at all. A perfect example is that the dollar from 1800 to 1913 actually gained 25% in value. In other words, what cost $1 in 1800 only cost 75 cents in 1913. However, what $1 could purchase in 1913, you now require $20 to buy the same thing. And what happened in 1913? The creation of the Federal Reserve. And what is the Federal Reserve Bank? There are most who think that the Federal Reserve, like the CIA and the FBI and the Department of Education and the Environmental Protection Agency, are in the Bible. Mm-hmm. See, that's why we have it, because they're in the Bible and therefore are acts of God. And that's what our system of public education tells us. That is what the media tells us. And that's what the government tells us. But the CIA came into existence in the 1940s. The Federal Reserve came into existence in 1913. Excuse me. And so therefore, not only are they not acts of God, the country existed for a very long period of time, even without those agencies being in existence. What is fractional reserve banking? Fractional reserve banking is the law that allows banks to lend more money than they have assets. Mm-hmm. And it ranges. It actually got to as low as 1% in the 1980s during the first banking collapse. And what that means is that a bank could loan $100 having only $1 in the vault. Now I think they've raised it to something like 5%, so that a bank must have $5 in the vault for every $100 they lend. And so you ask, how can the bank do that? Well, there's a couple ways the bank can do that. One is that they have deposits. You and I and other foolish people that trust in banks deposit our money into the bank and receive a paltry 0.5% or 1% return at best, and then the bank lends out that money from 5 to 9 or 10%. Now that's a racket that any mafioso would love to be part of. And so you deposit your money, and then the bank lends it out, and it gets all these deposits and lends out a certain amount of money. Now, how can the bank lend out more money than they're bringing in? Well, there's another thing they can do, is get money from a Federal Reserve Bank, which means that the Federal Reserve prints up money, hands it over to the bank, and then the bank lends out the money and makes a profit on that money. And the idea is that the bank will only lend out to reliable borrowers, so that the bank is assured of getting back not only interest payments but principal payments. Where does the Federal Reserve and other central banks get the money to lend to the banks? Well, they have something called a printing press. Thank Gutenberg for that. And what happens is that the government just simply prints money. It prints worthless paper, which we pretend has some intrinsic value, and it has no intrinsic value, but the government makes it appear that it does, and that gives us the false sense of security that there actually is something of value backing the dollar, and the only thing that's backing the dollar is the strength of your average politician. And so get your money out as soon as you can. Now, let's talk about bankers for a minute. Everybody thinks that bankers are professionals, but you know who owns banks? Real estate brokers, lawyers, accountants. There's really no such thing as a banking professional. The people who own banks know nothing about banking particularly, and it makes about as much sense as if someone who buys a restaurant knows something about making food. It doesn't work that way, and if you don't believe that, go to your average McDonald's or Burger King. And so the idea that people who run banks know something about banking is nonsensical, and we would all be very much surprised and chagrined if we knew how little they did know about banks. But what do bankers know about? Paying off politicians. That they know very well. And why do they pay off politicians? Because bankers, being completely incapable of determining a good asset from a failed asset, often lend money to individuals who don't know anything about what they're borrowing money for or the enterprise they're borrowing money for, and they lose all that money. So banks routinely lose vast sums of money, as we recently saw in the subprime loan catastrophe. And so, but these banks are still in business. Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo continue to be in business. Goldman Sachs continue to be in business, though they have proven themselves to be completely incompetent in the money lending business. But that doesn't matter, because the government has been paid off by these bankers, by the guy who runs Bank of America, by the guy who runs Goldman Sachs. And speaking of Goldman Sachs, let's name a few of their previous CEOs. John Corzine, who bankrupted whatever company he just bankrupted.
Yeah, I know.
Robert Rubin, who bankrupted two companies when he was head of Goldman Sachs and head of Citicorp.
They all leave with these huge golden parachutes.
That's right. And so Robert Rubin is a billionaire. John Corzine is wealthy. Needs to be in prison, but he's wealthy. And I can't remember some of the other guys. Paulson was also executive at Goldman Sachs. And so you have all these individuals that are politically connected to make sure that every time Goldman Sachs makes a stupid decision, which they do over and over and over again, like being involved to the tune of $18 billion in the subprime loan industry, by betting on the peso and then it was devalued, by giving money to Brazil, which then defaulted. So every time Goldman Sachs does a stupid thing. When Goldman Sachs makes the right guess, they keep the money. When they make the wrong guess, then they get reimbursed by the taxpayer. And that's how those operations function. And so let's go back to fractional reserve banking. So up until 1934, the banks were constrained to lend money only as a percentage of the amount of gold that they had. But Franklin Roosevelt said, I cannot create welfare with the restrictions that I have by the dollar being based upon the gold standard, because there's only a certain amount of gold out there, and therefore, since the dollar is pegged to gold, I can only lend a certain limited amount, even though it's 10 times more than the amount of gold. I'm still constrained that I can only lend 10 times more money than the amount of gold that I have. And so Franklin Roosevelt said, to make a welfare state, I need a lot more money than that, and therefore we're going to go off the gold standard, and that allows the government to create as much money as the printing press and can make as much money as there is paper, and there's plenty and plenty of paper. And so what do we have? We have the dollar, which is no longer based upon gold, which can be printed in any amounts that the government wants, and therefore the dollar is based upon the faith and security of the United States government, which is about as solid as the government of the Soviet Union was, and we know what happened there. So we're going to a break. We're going to come back and discuss a little bit more about economics. No, we're going to go talk
the Middle East.
Our...
Talking about economics, can we afford to be in the Middle East putting out all these fires?
Are the printing presses working?
I bet they are. We'll continue in a moment right here on the Talkback Radio Network. Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone.
You are listening to the Talkback Radio Network. We hope you're being enriched by our program today. You may be listening via our archives or to our live broadcast. Dr. Gelman and Rabbi Rosenberg broadcast live on Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern, 10 to 11 a.m. Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. You may call the show live during those times, toll free at 888-930-1787, 888-930-1787, or you can find us in the archives 24/7 at ironmicrophone.com.
Welcome to today's lottery drawing. And today's winning numbers are not yours, not yours, and another number that's not yours. And the final number is not yours.
When it comes to having money, don't rely on luck. Brew your own coffee at home instead of buying that latte. Brown bag it to work instead of ordering it. Go to feedthepig.org for more free ideas on how to save. Feedthepig.org. This message brought to you by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and the Ad Council.
Dr. Lawrence Gelman is a South Texas-based physician and hospital administrator. His mission is to empower Americans with knowledge that will help change the direction of our country. Dr. Gelman has produced a series of DVDs with the facts on myriad political, social, and economic issues. At this time, he is so passionate about our country and the state of our government that he's declared a moratorium on any costs associated with his DVDs. He'll even pay the postage. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the store link. Choose from many outstanding DVDs, including The Hoax, Global Warming, A Convenient Lie, Holocaust, Pro-Choice, The Myth of Roe vs. Wade, and more. Visit ironmicrophone.com. Arm yourself with information that will change minds as well as the future of our country. Order the DVDs now while they're free. Do it quickly because this offer is subject to change in 90 days. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the store tab to order your free DVD today.
Welcome back to the home of the Iron Microphone with your hosts, Dr. Lawrence Gelman and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg.
Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, and you. We are switching gears a bit this morning and not really switching gears. We've been talking about money this morning and talking about now whether we should invest that money in supporting other problems around the world, especially right now what's going on in Syria, civil war in Syria. Should we be behind arming the Syrian rebels? or not. With us on the phone is Malu Innocent. She's a foreign policy analyst with the Cato Institute. She's a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and her primary research interests include the Middle East security issues and U.S. foreign policy. And we bid you welcome, Ms. Innocent.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being on our program. Okay, the Middle East again is lighting up like a powder keg. Primarily, what's going on in Syria, and we see now that it's becoming pretty apparent that this civil war, which it looks like it's going to turn into, or if it is already, is not going away anytime soon. And you've had people like John McCain who have been pretty forceful in their remarks about our involvement in Syria. What say you?
Well, I think that there are several dynamics sort of going on all at once. Not only do we see something of what looks to be a civil war rapidly developing within Syria, but as you mentioned, we also have some in Washington who have called for intervening directly either through a NATO-led no-fly zone or by arming the Syrian resistance. I think that certainly the latter of the two options seems to be the most antiseptic in terms of sort of going in and rapidly extracting our forces and our presence, as we saw with the intervention in Libya. I think part of the problem actually is the shadow of Libya. You saw with the United Nations Security Council, the Russians and the Chinese condemn and vote against the U.S.-led effort to sort of condemn the Bashar al-Assad regime and to bring about a sort of a unity government within Damascus. And part of that was because the Russian and Chinese governments believed that the United Nations and sort of NATO overextended the resolution in Libya to exact regime change against the Gaddafi regime. They don't want to see another play of that. They don't want to see the United States again exerting its presence, especially with a sort of former Soviet Union client state, given the level of influence that Russia and China still have with the Assad regime. So I think the shadow of Libya looms large, and even the most antiseptic option, such as arming the resistance, is gaining a great deal of resistance, both amongst the UN Security Council members and also amongst many Americans.
Do you think, though, that the American public is ready for another war going into a country with our own troops? And you know as well as I do that there's a big difference between an air assault and a ground war. And we now have fought war on two fronts, with principally with Iraq and Afghanistan. And if there is a UN option, how much of the United States, what should the United States do to commit its assets? How many assets should we commit? Or is it just at this point really a foolhardy effort? Should we just sit back, let things happen as they may? I guess the other question I have for you is, what is the big difference between Libya and Syria in this? We had no problem running into Syria and taking care of business. Running into Libya and taking care of business. Here Syria seems like to be a much different problem, and I would like you to go specifically talk a bit about why is it? What does Syria have that Libya didn't have? What is it about Syria that we are a bit more cautious about?
I'm happy you asked that question. I'll take the first one first and the second one second. I think part of the reason you see a great deal of reluctance from the American people to intervene abroad, whether that be in Syria or with Iran, is the unpredictable nature of intervention. We know where we start, but we don't know where we're going to end. And certainly, again, the antiseptic option of a NATO-led no-fly zone may appear, at least, to not allow for boots on the ground, but we never really know. There might be a contingency where a NATO plane is shot down, in which case will there be pressure to ratchet up our own sort of involvement and then begin to have boots on the ground. There's really no way to predict where war will be, where the conflict will end. And so I think there's sort of a feeling that it'll be almost like a vortex where we sort of put in our hand and next our shoulders are going to be sucked in and then we're in full stop. I think with that, and it's sort of getting to the second question in terms of what are the differences between Libya and Syria, I think the differences are quite vast, beginning at the top. You see with Gaddafi, he was sort of viewed as low-hanging fruit. He didn't have a great number of allies in the international community. He sort of alienated a great number of the Arab states. He had some support with governments in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, but it wasn't really the level of support that you see with Assad. Assad, his days don't look as numbered as they did with Gaddafi. Assad has the support of regimes such as in Moscow and in Beijing. They have the support of al-Maliki's government in Iraq. Until recently, they had the support of Hamas. They had the support of, again, the Iranian government. So I think Assad has really just, he's extended his influence in such a way that Gaddafi did not. And so there are more governments that are willing to stick their neck out and support the Assad regime. That, and I think there are also issues in terms of the population of Syria versus the population in Libya. Syria is almost like Lebanon in a sense of a country of various minorities, and now sort of assisting one of those rebel groups or one of those sort of insurgent groups within Syria, there's a potential that even in the future, if we do see any sort of semblance of a unity government, it could rapidly fall apart. And it might even fall apart more rapidly than we're seeing in Libya. You don't see the ethnic fissures that you see in Syria, but still the rebels that U.S. and NATO backed are now exacting revenge on Gaddafi loyalists. So will there be sort of an even deeper civil war or genocide or crimes against humanity even now that Gaddafi's gone, and would we see that with Assad? So I think it's a bit of apples and oranges, and certainly I think to your point that we really need to understand those two conflicts much differently and understand sort of what will be necessary in order to sort of bring about an end to the civil war.
Well, aren't they actually, isn't it actually the same philosophy throughout the Middle East? I mean, I really don't see that much of a difference between Libya and Syria, other than that Syria is putting up a much more aggressive defense. Maybe some political differences there, but I think you have entrenched statist regimes that are to a degree secular, one more than the other. And then you have the Arab fundamentalist Muslims who are trying to create a pan-Islamic movement among Arabs, at least. And isn't that really what's going on? Isn't that why Libya happened? Isn't that why Syria is happening? Isn't that exactly what's going on in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many Turkey and Pakistan? Isn't it really the same movement trying to paint itself as somehow different, but essentially identical, and that is to replace secular or moderately fundamentalist governments with extreme Arab fundamentalist governments?
Well, certainly we see the rise of Islamist parties and Islamist movements across the region, whether that be, as you mentioned, in Syria or in Libya or in other various countries. I think the differences certainly are country by country in terms of history and sort of the issue of ethnic minorities, but certainly there is a case to be made that we're sort of seeing a sort of a resurgence of Islamism, of political Islamism, and whether that really brings about a democracy in the guise that we like, I think is really up for grabs and really sort of subject to great contention. When you look at the way the parliamentary elections have played out in Egypt, it is not very comforting to those who are arguing for supporting sort of the liberal protesters, because as we've seen from the elections, the liberal protesters have really been marginalized, given the support to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafist parties and the Al-Nawar parties. So I think in some respects, there are certainly a lot of differences, but there are also a great number of similarities across the region.
So what should we do, if anything?
I think it depends on with which countries.
Take your pick. I mean, we wouldn't know what we did in Libya, but what should we do in the countries that are in flux, such as Iraq, such as Egypt, Syria, obviously the most critical at the moment? What should we do, if anything?
Well, I think really there's a very limited amount of what we really can achieve in terms of trying to shape the destinies of these countries. I think also our leverage is different depending on the country we're talking about. If we're talking about Syria, I think our leverage is limited to trying to push the Russians to really push Assad, given the fact that the Russians are the ones that are supplying the Assad regime with the tens of billions of dollars in arms and defensive equipment to this day. So I think that will require a different method of operation compared to, say, Egypt, where we've given over $60 billion to the Egyptian government over the past 60 years. So our level of influence and leverage is going to be much different there. So I think it certainly depends on what country we're talking about, and I think overall we've sort of been sort of realized that our ability to influence these events and shape the events to our liking has really diminished.
Well, we have been able to influence events to a great deal. Iraq and Afghanistan are two prime examples. Seems to me more of it is on the longevity of the government that was in power. I think one reason that Egypt and Libya fell so rapidly was because they had an aged leader that was versus Bashar Assad, that is hereditary role. He's a young man and in a minority sect, and it seems that has as much to do with it as anything else. I doubt if Mubarak could have been overthrown 20 years ago, even under the same circumstances that exist recently, or that Muammar Gaddafi 20 or 25 years ago could have been overthrown. I think they were overthrown because they were just simply older and did not have that necessary flexibility of action or aggressiveness of action. Even Gaddafi himself, I don't think, was really prepared for what happened, versus Assad, who he and his father were always cognizant of the risks of their power base and lack of same. And so I think that is about as much as anything else. I do believe that if there had been no Bashar Assad and his father was in the whatever age he would have been today, that he would have been as easily overthrown as Gaddafi and Mubarak. So I think that has about as much significance as anything else, just how much you want to hold on to power.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much we've really changed the underlying dynamic. You mentioned that we've sort of been able to shape Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm curious exactly how.
Well, in Iraq, we got rid of a secular regime. It's going to be replaced by a fundamentalist regime that is anti-American. It's a complete change of government there, much to our disfavor, actually. And in Afghanistan, we took a nothing nation and we've made it into what's now going to become probably a great terrorist training ground, and a problem with Pakistan, which we created, by the way. The problem in Pakistan today is United States created by forcing the radical fundamentalists out of Afghanistan into Pakistan, which is the reason for their instability over the last 8 or 10 years. So I do think we've had a very, very significant, though negative, effect on what's going on in the Middle East. In fact, in my opinion, all the problems in the Middle East really are due to the United States intervention. I
see where you're coming from in terms of our ability to sort of shape the outcome that we seek. I guess that's sort of different than I understand where you're coming from in the sense that we've knocked over governments that and we haven't been able to really create the end state that we had hoped or that we thought that we could achieve. And certainly I think that that's an accurate sort of assessment to make. And as you mentioned with Pakistan especially, considering the billions of dollars that we've given to the government in Islamabad and their lack of enthusiasm for cracking down on militant sanctuaries that feed the very forces that our troops are fighting in Afghanistan. I think you're certainly right in that respect. And I think we really sort of have to bring that level of skepticism also to North Africa and the Middle East, and really sort of seeing how these new incipient democracies begin to form. They certainly, from my vantage point, won't turn into liberal democracies.
But also, I think we have to look at the big picture and say, if we knock out Bashar Assad, what is in his place? What comes after him? Is it worse? Is it, is it going to be a government that's now even less favorable to the United States? I think that also with Assad, we have to remember that their roots are Ba'athist, which has a great deal to do with, I think, their own fundamental power structure. And people forget another Ba'athist was Saddam Hussein, who we were great friends with in the 80s, and thought that he was our man. And so I think that we've got this. We have to look at the global picture and from a macro sense to see who is next up, who's going to be on deck. Is it going to be worse than what we have now? The one conventional wisdom is the devil you know is worse than the devil that you don't know.
Right. I mean, I would tend to agree in the sense that there is a high potential for the regimes that replace the regimes that are in power to be much worse, whether that be toward U.S. foreign policy in the region or toward domestic minority groups. In fact, you hear from the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood that should the Assad regime be overthrown, it will be a matter of moments before they begin to exterminate the Alawites, the Shia Alawites. So there's certainly a potential for another Iraq type of scenario where you sort of see another escalating civil war among the various minority groups. I think also the issue of, we've seen the pogrom against Coptic Christians in Egypt. Part of that was, of course, assisted by the Mubarak regime to sort of sow discontent, to sort of divide and rule strategy. But we're also seeing that now under the military-led regime, under the SCAF. And I think right now, unfortunately, many people in the region, they really had their hopes on democracy, and certainly, democracy has many virtues. But I think if we look at the fact that these regimes will not bring about a liberal democracy as we had hoped, I mean, this is part of the stumble of democratic principles. I think they're sort of trying to shape their own destinies and understanding exactly how they're going to reconcile a lot of the contradictions within in terms of what they want to see within their own governments, but also how certain Islamic principles that the Islamist parties espouse really undercut the very democratic principles that they claim to champion. And I think really a lot of these governments and these people in the region, they must sort of wrestle with these contradictions on their own. And the more they see sort of the Western powers, or even, the Eastern powers for that matter, breathing down their collective neck, I think it'll sort of undercut their ability to resolve those issues internally.
Malu, thank you so much for coming on our program. We'd love to hear you again later on. And thank you so much for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
It is our pleasure indeed. Malu Innocent has been our guest this segment. We'll continue in a moment with your phone calls, 1-888-930-1787. You're listening to the Talkback Radio Network, home of the Iron Microphone.
You are listening to the Talkback Radio Network. We hope you're being enriched by our program today. You may be listening via our archives or to our live broadcast. Dr. Gelman and Rabbi Rosenberg broadcast live on Thursdays from 11 a.m. to 12 noon Eastern, 10 to 11 a.m. Central, and 8 to 9 a.m. Pacific. You may call the show live during those times, toll free at 888-930-1787, 888-930-1787, or you can find us in the archives 24/7 at ironmicrophone.com.
Welcome to Move Time Radio, presented by the Arthritis Foundation, and we're smack dab in the middle of our dance-a-thon to fight arthritis pain. Me, I've been grooving for 10 hours straight, baby, but I'm a boogie machine. See, movement is just one of the ways to help fight osteoarthritis pain. Another is weight loss. You get rid of just 1 pound. That's 4 pounds of pressure off each knee. For more information on managing pain, visit fightarthritispain.org. Then meet me on the dance floor. This message brought to you by the Arthritis Foundation and the Ad Council.
Dr. Lawrence Gelman is a South Texas-based physician and hospital administrator. His mission is to empower Americans with knowledge that will help change the direction of our country. Dr. Gelman has produced a series of DVDs with the facts on myriad political, social, and economic issues. At this time, he is so passionate about our country and the state of our government that he's declared a moratorium on any costs associated with his DVDs. He'll even pay the postage. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the store link. Choose from many outstanding DVDs, including The Hoax, Global Warming, A Convenient Lie, Holocaust, Pro-Choice, The Myth of Roe vs. Wade, and more. Visit ironmicrophone.com. Arm yourself with information that will change minds as well as the future of our country. Order the DVDs now while they're free. Do it quickly because this offer is subject to change in 90 days. Visit ironmicrophone.com and click on the Store tab to order your free DVD today.
back to Talkback Radio with your hosts, Dr. Lawrence Gelman and Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg.
Rabbi Stephen Rosenberg and Dr. Lawrence Gelman talking with you about the Middle East a bit. Our guest was Malu Innocent, who very well-known and quite respected Middle East foreign policy expert, and we heard her views. We'd like to hear Dr. Gelman's and yours. If you'd like to call us, you can reach us at 1-888-930-1787. Should we get involved in Syria? Should that even be on our plate? We've got enough on our plate now. What do you think? 1-888-930-1787 is our talkback number. Dr. Gelman, your thoughts?
American foreign policy is a disaster, and it's a disaster because purposefully we support statist regimes against the people. No surprise there. We do it to our own people. Why wouldn't we do it to others? The results of our intervention in most of the wars, not all, but most, have been to increase the power of the state and enslave the people, whether it was handing over the Soviet Union to the communists, or handing over China to the communists, handing over Eastern Europe to the communists, or Cuba to the communists, or whether it's handing over Egypt, Syria, and Libya to fascists. It's really all the same. The United States is a pro-fascist philosophy, and that's not a surprise because all politicians, with rare exceptions, are fascist. They believe in power of the state over the people, and they believe in the aristocratic rule of a few over the many, and that there does exist a divine right of kings, which says that Barack Obama and George Bush actually believe that they have some innate right and obligation to control the lives of millions upon millions of people. Now, what's going on in the Middle East? The situation in Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, all the rest of those countries is much more alike than different. The names may change and the geography may change, but the underlying motivations are the same. And what are they? The unhappiness with the people in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Jordan, in Turkey, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Pakistan has nothing to do with a desire for democracy, has nothing to do with improvement of living conditions, has nothing to do with gaining equality, and has everything to do with a hate of Western civilization and all that Western civilization represents, in particular Israel, not because Israel is filled with a bunch of Jewish people, but because Israel is a Western-style democracy in the middle of a raging sea of Arab fascistic fundamentalism. Muammar Gaddafi, Mubarak, and all the others have stayed in power in their miserable countries by promoting a propagandist-based philosophy that the West is the enemy, that the Jews are the enemy, that Christians are the enemy, and that not the government that keeps them in poverty, but these outside forces. The United States not only has not tried to negate that propaganda, it has helped promote it through its funding program. Perfect example, Saudi Arabia, which is the foremost promoter of terrorism in the world, is also the foremost promoter of Wahhabism, the most radical form of Islamic fundamentalism, which hates Western thought. That is why there are no churches or synagogues allowed to be built in Saudi Arabia. And where does Saudi Arabia get most of its money? From the United States in one manner or another, whether through direct subsidy or whether it is through the purchasing of their oil. And so these countries' governments stay in power by promoting in their school systems and in their media a hate for Western ideology. So you have all of these individuals growing up in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Pakistan and all the rest, being inundated and immersed in a philosophy of anti-Western thought, of enslavement, women are chattel, that all other points of view are wrong, and intolerance, there's other points of view. And so you just think of your average person in Egypt, your average male, young male in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, in Lebanon, etc. And what are they thinking? All my life I've been told in my system of public education, in my mosque, and on the media, that we need to wage war, jihad, against all of Western civilization. And yet, not only do we not wage war against Western civilization, we actually take money from the infidel himself. And so these people are growing up in that environment, and they're saying, it's been 20 years, it's been 30 years, it's been 40 years, it's been 50 years. When are we going to destroy Israel? When are we going to kill all the Christians? When are we going to destroy the United States? And so what has happened is, as time has gone by and the leadership ages and the burgeoning Arab fundamentalist population grows, there is this discontent, there is this fervor, there is this boiling cauldron of activity in nations that have no jobs, that have no future, that not only live in the 10th century, they want to live in the 10th century. And so what has happened is you finally have, it's an equation, and you finally have enough components in the equation that overpower the status in power and overthrow those governments, or seek to overthrow those governments, not for democracy, not for egalitarianism, not for jobs, not for a better future, but to actually launch war against the West. And that is what's going on in the Middle East today. A burgeoning young population of males with nothing else to do, that have been indoctrinated to hate the West, that are now, they have now reached a mass effect. Enough of them now exist that just by sheer weight and sheer mass, they are able to take over control, or at least launch attacks upon controlling elements, so that when they're going to take power, and it doesn't matter that if you're in Syria or Egypt or Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq or Libya, it doesn't matter, because they look at themselves as pan-Arabist Islamists, and they're all going to unite in a great holy war against the West. And that is what's going on. And your feeble-minded nincompoops in the United States, such as Hillary Clinton, who's about as big as ignoramus as we've ever had as a Secretary of State, Barack Obama, who in his heart is Muslim anyway, and above all a statist, and you have all these Republicans like John McCain who are statists, and they are completely blind to the reality. And so what we're going to do is we're going to help these fundamentalists take over, and we're going to find ourselves at the other end of their guns. And is that unusual? Of course not. Because who created the Soviet Union? The United States. Who created Communist China? The United States. Who created Communist Cuba? The United States. Who created Communist Eastern Europe? The United States. Who created Communist Vietnam? The United States. And on and on and on. And why? Because we ourselves are a fascist communist government that exists to exert centralized control over the people. That is the belief that our politicians have. Therefore, they are sympathetic with every statist movement in the world, whether it's Stalin, whether it's Mao, whether it's the Ayatollah Khomeini, whether it's Fidel Castro, beloved communist dictator of your Hollywood elite. And so that is it. Even though it is a whole world that I'm looking at, if you start looking at it the way you should be looking at it and not the way the media presents it, then you will start to understand what's going on, not only in the world, but what's going on in the United States. And that is what? A war between those who believe in individual liberty and against those who believe in centralized control.
Why is it that we always prop up these people that turn around and bite us?
I just told you. No, haven't you been listening?
I've been listening, but why is it we continue to do it over and over again?
I just told you. I guess I'm not being clear.
Maybe you're not.
Well, maybe you don't understand.
Or maybe I'm listening.
Because it's very basic. You have status and
Right.
individualists. And what is government by definition? Statist. What organization creates foreign policy? The American people or the government? Therefore, the government creates foreign policy, the government is statist, and therefore they're going to promote statism not merely in the United States, but in the rest of the world. Why do we support Stalin? Because he's a statist. We're statists. Why do we support Mao? Because he's a statist. We're statist.
But it doesn't seem to work. And every time...
It works exactly the way we want it to work. The United States wanted Stalin in power.
Right.
We got Stalin in power. The United States wanted Mao in power. We got Mao in power. The United States wanted Castro in power. We got Castro in power. The United States wants Arab fundamentalist Muslims in power, and that's what we're getting.
When you say the United States wants these strong men in power, and you can go back to Egypt, go back and take a look at the people we've supported, going way back, and it is in not just Egypt but a lot of these countries where we have supported people that in the end of the day wind up biting us in the rear. But you're right. But your point is, if I'm understanding you, is that they maintain a certain level of continuity that we want. Is that correct?
A continuity of philosophy in the belief that the state should enslave the population. That is what the United States government believes. That is what all governments believe to one degree or another. And so therefore we're always going to support those that will impose statist control, centralized control over the people, because that is what our philosophy is. The trick is to get the American people to believe that it is in the interest of the American people. The same way the American government wishes the American people to believe that our government is working for the benefit of the people. Our government exists to work for in its own benefit and to enslave the American people, and that is the only reason that our government exists, is to enslave the American people.
So what do we do about it? Where do we go?
Well, you could elect Ron Paul to do something about it. But why is the media and the Republican Party against Ron Paul? Because he believes in the Constitution, which is based on the Declaration of Independence, which is the philosophical basis of individual liberty, freedom, and independence. Now, you may say, well, if that is the case, why the conflict between these statist regimes? And my response to that is, why do mafiosos go to war with each other? They obviously all believe the same way, but they're competing one against the other. The Soviet Union and Red China came out of the same source, out of the same crucible, yet they almost went to war with each other and ended up hating each other. Why? Because they are competing in the same arena. So even though they're all ball players playing in the same game, they hate each other because they're in competition with each other like mafioso families. And so the idea that somehow we support one or the other because of conflicting ideologies is not true. They're not conflicting ideologies. They're identical ideologies that are in conflict because they're in competition within the same ideology.
So if we have this and we have these regimes,
can't be any clearer.
No, it's very clear. It's very clear. But if you look from a global perspective, we keep on having this methodology that we employ, and it keeps on hitting us in the head, but we keep on doing it. And I understand that we are looking for continuity,
it doesn't hit us in the head. We get exactly what we want. George Bush gave a speech in Kiev while he was president, referred to by as the Chicken Kiev speech, in which he admonished Ukraine and other nations that were breaking off from the Soviet Union from becoming independent, that it was a mistake, that they ought to stay with a centralized regime. We are getting exactly what we get. The United States, George Bush, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and all the rest would much prefer a Soviet Union in competition with the United States than a free and independent Soviet Union. Our preference is to have statist regimes because we are much more comfortable in dealing with dictatorial statists than we are with a free people. So between having a free Russian people and having a centralized controlled Soviet Union, Bill and Hillary Clinton and all the rest and George Bush and all the rest would much prefer to have a statist regime in competition with the United States. That's something that we understand, that we feel we can deal with, versus having a free population, something that our politicians do not understand and fear, because there's nothing government fears more than a free and independent populace.
Hence our support, our very, very, I think, strong support of Vladimir Putin, who would fit into that category very well as a statist, and who wants to have much more central power in the former Soviet Union. Would you agree?
That's why we love Putin. That's why we love Castro. That's why we love Mao. That's why we love Stalin. That's why we love every statist, because Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and George Bush are much more comfortable dealing with them. We politicians consider themselves aristocrats, and they respect each other as fellow travelers. Yes, they compete the same way baseball teams compete, but they respect each other, and ball players respect each other because they understand each other and they have the same philosophy and ideology. What government and politicians don't like, because they don't understand and fear. And what they fear is a population that is free and independent, because that is something which is contrary to the very basis of government, which is enslavement.
So let me ask you, why are people, when they think of Ron Paul, and hopefully we'll get him on our program, we're working on it, why, when they see his views on foreign policy, which he is really in favor of just non-intervention, why is it that generates such a negative response, even in Republicans?
They fear what he represents. He represents the constitutional basis of government and limitation on government action. He believes that the individual should be in charge of his or her own life, as free from the constraints of a centralized authority. That is what he believes. That belief is an anathema to all politicians, whether they are Democrat or Republican. And the media is nothing but a propaganda arm of the government, as is the system of public education. And so Ron Paul stands alone against the statists. And that is why he is reviled by all statists, whether it is Mitt Romney, Barack Obama, Mitch McConnell, or Harry Reid. Ron Paul stands for the principles of the founding of the nation: individual liberty, freedom, and independence. That is why he is hated by all of these politicians who believe in centralized control. Ron Paul is a constitutionalist. The rest of our government is a bunch of fascists.
And so that pretty much blends it down to the nitty gritty there. Well, it's interesting, because in the context of that, and we'll be talking more about next few weeks, the economy will be getting into a little bit more about some abortion issues and some other things. We always, of course, like your comments as well, and you can certainly address them right here to us at the Talkback Radio Network. We will see you next week at this current time, same station. You can always leave a message, 1-888-930-1787. We'll talk to you next week. Until then, you have a good week. You take care.